If someone murders a person you love, you get upset. But why do you get upset? You want them to pay for what they've done. But why do we want justice? They took something of value, but why do we value that person that they took from us? Did they have intrinsic value, or did we just decide that they're valuable? If we just decided, then why does murder elicit these kinds of responses for us when we see people we don't externally value? We think what they did was immoral, but why is it immoral? Where did these morals come from? We'll be talking about all of that and more in this episode. Welcome everybody, my name is Stan Christopoulos and you're listening to Exploring Reality, where we attempt to show the rational side of the Christian faith. We're in the middle of a very, very long series called the Defending the Bible series. It's still going on, but because there's so much to it and because of popular demand, I'm going to also keep doing other arguments in the midst of this. So the Bible series now is instead going to be a constant ongoing series rather than something with a definitive end, kind of like what the Kalam cosmological argument had. So a lot of you requested that I put work into other arguments. Request granted. This is the introduction video to the argument for God's existence called the moral argument or the argument from morality. Very similar to the form that the Kalam series had. In this first video, I'm going to go over the history of the argument. I'm going to show you the argument in a deductive form. We're going to define a lot of terms, and then I'm going to explore the logical conclusion and what it means in terms of reality. The next videos will cover evidence to support the argument, and then I'll be covering common and the top objections to the argument as well. So let's get into it. The history of the argument. So the argument from morality was originally made by a German philosopher named Immanuel Kant. He lived in 1724 to 1804, and he was known for his works in epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, and aesthetics. He based this argument on something he called practical reasoning. So in philosophy, practical reason is the use of reason to decide how to act. Kant argued that the goal of humanity is to achieve perfect happiness and virtue. This goal was called the summum bonum, which is a Latin expression meaning the highest good, the tip of moral goodness, the limit, the standard itself of good. He also believed that an afterlife must exist in order for this summum bonum to exist, and that God must exist to provide this. Moving on, C.S. Lewis, a British scholar, which a lot of you probably know of, argued the same. He says, and I quote, "Conscience reveals to us moral law whose source cannot be found in the natural world, thus pointing to a supernatural lawgiver." So what he's saying here is that our conscience itself reveals moral law. The source cannot be grounded in the natural world, and there must be a supernatural moral lawgiver if this supernatural moral law exists. So these people believed objective moral truths existed and do exist because our conscience reveals it. And it drives people to act morally even when it is not in their own interest. Essentially saying that if objective moral laws exist, the only way they do exist is through God. The only other option is that there are no objective moral laws and God does not exist. Which, if that is true, has a lot of fatal implications. In contrast to how we live our lives, we'll cover throughout the series. Some examples of these implications just as an introduction. For instance, this means that there is no such thing as true, ultimate good versus evil. Meaning what Hitler did isn't actually wrong. We'll hit that a lot more on the next videos, so that's just an example for the time being. So with that out of the way, let's cover the argument in a deductive form. There are many forms it can take, but this is the simplest in my opinion and the strongest. So premise one If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Conclusion. Therefore, God exists. So that's the deductive form of the argument. It's pretty easy to see how it lines up and how it's valid. So, again, because it's deductive, the only way to prove that it's true is by defending the premises and showing that they're true. And the only way to attack it is by attacking the premises to show that they're false. So, again, the premises are P1. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. And premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. So if P1 and P2 are true, then the logically inescapable conclusion is that God exists. So before we go further, this is one of the most misunderstood arguments out there. It's given birth to a lot of atheist memes and all this other stuff, but here's an example. Christopher Hitchens, God rest his soul, was a very popular anti-theist. He's a person that commonly heard this argument and responded by being insulted most of the time. What he and many other people will hear is, you can't be moral without God. What this argument is actually saying, though, is that objective moral values and duties exist, and that we all know them because we're born with knowledge of them, and that these can only be grounded in the nature of God, not humans or nature itself. It's positing that God must exist, otherwise these morals are nothing but an illusion or an opinion, meaning again that there's no such thing as true, right, or wrong. Again, I am not saying that you need to believe in God to be a moral person in society. What I am saying is that anyone can be a moral person because these objective morals and duties exist, and God created us with intrinsic knowledge of them. This means that anybody can be a good person irregardless of their beliefs. This is strictly an attempt to explain the reality of where these morals come from and what they're grounded in and justified by. This also says that if God does not exist, then again, morality is nothing but an illusion or an opinion, and that means that basic human rights, as a lot of people like to fight for these days, don't actually exist. That means that murder isn't actually wrong because wrong does not actually exist as a standard. So we're talking about a lot of different terms here, and because of the nuance and semantics that go into this, I think it's really important to define a lot of terms so we're on the same page, and that way we kind of prevent any rabbit holes and distractions from the argument. So let's just go through and define some terms here. Objective refers to truth that is independent of personal feelings or opinions when representing facts. In other words, it's something that's true outside of human influence. An example of this would be 2 + 2 = 4 would always be true even if humans never existed. Subjective means truth that is influenced by personal feelings or opinions, not representing objective facts. Morals, concerned with the principles of right or wrong behavior and the goodness or badness of human character. Morality, principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior. Intrinsic, part of the essential nature of someone or something coming or operating from the inside. Extrinsic, not part of the essential nature of someone or something coming or operating from outside. The word value I'm going to define as a noun and a verb. So as a noun, it's the level of regard that something is held to deserve, the importance, worth, or usefulness of something. As a verb, it's the act of considering someone or something to be important or beneficial. And then duty or duties is a moral obligation or obligations, or responsibility and responsibilities. Those terms will do for now. There's going to be more that we need to define in the future. But remember, it's important that we're on the same page about these terms, because if we're speaking different languages, we're not going to get anywhere. And if we're at an understanding of what each word means, when we use them, we eliminate potential distractions from the point of the argument. So a clear example of why this is important is the term objective moral law. So it has 3 words that we defined in it. With that, I'll attempt to define what an objective moral law is without using any of the words within the term. So a rule that dictates right or wrong or good or bad human behavior that is always true independent of human opinion is my attempt at defining objective moral law. So what does this argument mean? What are the biggest takeaways? One, essentially, is that objective moral laws exist and that we all intrinsically have knowledge of them. In other words, our conscience reveals this moral law within us, and we can clearly see this in the way that we value other humans as intrinsically valuable. These objective moral laws can only be grounded in a being like God, not in nature or in humans. It's also worth noting that this argument is a topic of ontology, which is whether or not something exists, rather than epistemology, the study of how we know these things. So here's an example of what I mean. Whether we know or don't know or agree or disagree to the speed limit on the street we're driving on, it has no bearing on the existence of the speed limit. The law exists independent of your knowledge or agreement to it. The same concept applies to the existence of objective moral facts. If they exist, it doesn't really matter what you or I know or believe. They exist. Likewise, if they don't exist, it doesn't matter what you and I know or believe. They don't exist. Our belief and our agreement to these things have no bearing on the reality of whether or not they exist. This argument also points out that you cannot derive an ought from an is. So for an objective moral law to exist, it has to come from a standard outside of humanity and nature. If it comes from either of those, again, like I said earlier, this is subjective morality or relativism, aka morality is relative to the person or it's just an illusion. Deciding that you ought not punch someone because it would harm him then presupposes under that worldview that causing harm is bad or immoral. But under that worldview, there's no standard outside of humanity and nature to tell us why it's bad. Why is it bad to harm somebody? I'm not being facetious. I don't know how to pronounce that word. But I'm not being difficult here. I'm actually asking an honest question. In that worldview where God does not exist and objective moral values don't exist, what does bad actually mean? What does immoral actually mean? And why are these things bad or immoral? Another thing to think about is that this argument poses 2 very different realities that could exist depending on the outcome of what you do with the argument, whether or not you agree to it. So we either live in a moral reality where objective moral categories exist, or an amoral or without moral sense of good and evil reality, where, again, morality is nothing but illusory or an opinion. In an amoral universe, objective moral categories do not exist, so no action can be called good or bad. While someone may not like someone else's actions, there's no justification or grounding for disliking their actions or calling it wrong or evil, because there's no standard outside of humans and nature to compare that act to. In this reality, there's no moral difference between a mother feeding her child or torturing the child for fun. And that kind of leads into what I wanted to talk about as a full disclosure here. Because of the nature of this argument and the topics it tries to tackle, we're going to be talking about some really deep things here. I'm going to have to bring up some horrific acts throughout history out of necessity for the topic. If I'm going to talk about what evil actually is, I have to represent it for what it actually is and bring up examples of it. There are probably going to be instances also where I make a claim that are only slightly validated, strictly because this argument kind of pulls into different sub-arguments, and I'm not really here to talk about those, at least in the context of this series. So for instance, there's a other argument that talks about free will versus determinism and whether or not we actually make choices or natural law makes choices for us, all this other stuff. I'll try to be clear about those instances where these ramifications come into the argument and let you guys know. But for the time being, if I talk about something like that, just know that it's coming from a different argument. So please let me know in the comments where I lose you guys if I do, and let me know what exactly it was that lost you, so that way I know how to do better in the future, and I also then know what to go back to define in future videos. And that's the end of the introduction. Next video, we're going to defend the premises and show you how and why they're true. For this video, like I said, I just wanted to get your brains moving and thinking with this video, so that way you can kind of set your gears for the evidence of the premises. Thank you so much for listening. Let me know what you guys thought. Like, comment, sub, and share with your friends and family. If you're interested in having an apologetic speaker at your church, whether it's virtual or in person, starting soon, I'm actually going to be offering a free sermon, or whatever you want to call it, and it's just going to be a presentation on the collective case for Christianity. So if you're interested, you can contact me at my website. The link will be in the description. With that, thank you so much for listening. Let me know what you guys thought, and be ready. Come with a rested brain for the next video.